Thank you all for joining us today. While you are not audible or visible to the presenters, we encourage you to ask questions through the Q&A function. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the Hastings Center website later today. And now I would like to turn to Dr. Nancy Berlinger, a research scholar at the Hastings Center, where she oversees research on ethical and societal challenges arising from population aging.
Thank you, Ashna, and welcome everyone. We are very excited to have you here today for this webinar, which is the last in a series exploring findings from a report released in October by the Joint Center for Housing Studies and the Hastings Center. Our report, Advancing Housing and Health Equity for Older Adults, includes innovations and ideas from housing-focused responses to the needs of older adults during the COVID-19 pandemic. What we're going to be focusing on today are how these ideas can be carried forward to the work of housing our aging societies. So I invite our panelists to turn on their cameras, and I will introduce everyone, and then we'll get started. And we'll be including links to the publications we mentioned to be shared with audience members. So you don't have to worry if you miss the name of something. You'll see the link turn up. So I'm really delighted to have Paul McGarry here with us today. He is Assistant Director of the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, a regional network of cities and towns adjacent to the city of Manchester in the north of England. He leads the Greater Manchester Aging Hub, whose initiatives include a framework for creating age-friendly homes. And we're going to be hearing some more about that framework later, and we'll be sharing the framework itself. Andrew Clark is a professor in the School of Health and Society at the University of Salford in Greater Manchester. He studies how older adults experience their homes and neighborhoods and has collaborated with local policymakers, including Paul and his colleagues. Stephen Lovesey is Vice President for Capital Projects and Construction at Phipps Houses, the oldest and largest not-for-profit developer, owner, and manager of affordable housing in New York City. He previously directed capital projects for the New York City Housing Authority. And my colleague Jennifer Malinsky directs the Housing and Aging Society program at the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard University. She previously worked as a community planner in the Boston region and teaches community planning at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. And I also want to give a shout out to our colleagues behind the scenes, Bailey Hu, who is a research assistant in the Housing and Aging Society program at Harvard, and she's the co-author of our report, and Ashna Lal, my Hastings Center colleague, who's a project manager and research assistant at the Hastings Center. So I just want to remind the audience in general to post questions via Q&A, and we'll get to as many as we can. We have 3 different ways of taking your questions today. One is that you can post a question in the chat, and Ashna and Bailey will be reviewing those questions, and some may be factual questions, especially about our report. And you have Bailey, one of the co-authors, right there, and she can answer that question. Some of them, which may be discussion questions to suggest for the group, they will forward to me, and then I will do my best to weave them in. So if you don't hear your question, it might be someone else's question. So we'll do our best. We have a very large audience today, very diverse audience. So we hope to get to as many as we can. And finally, if there's time, we will take some questions at the very end of our presentation before 1 o'clock New York City time. So we'll do our best. But first of all, let's get to some of our initial questions that we want to discuss. Today, we're going to talk about housing the aging societies of the United States and the United Kingdom, focusing on cities and metropolitan regions. Within this group alone, we have a lot of expertise, very practical on-the-ground expertise from Greater Manchester, from the Boston metropolitan area, and from the New York City metropolitan area. So there are ways that we can talk across our nations, because we are looking at similar demographics and some of the similar dynamics when you think about cities and suburbs. We're going to explore 3 sets of shared ideas, which are called narratives. Sometimes they're called policy narratives, to discuss ways to frame housing needs and goals that will build support among policymakers and the general public. Our participants bring a wealth of experience as municipal and regional policymakers, as practitioners in architecture and community planning, and as researchers who study the social experience of aging and the places that aging people use. Several of us also bring lived experience as care partners of older adults who are negotiating these very issues that we're going to be talking about today. So the first narrative to get us started is the place in aging in place. Jen, we talk about this all the time. Going back to 2019, when we did a symposium, we talked about aging in a place. And I've learned so much from collaborating with you and other colleagues who are planners and architects and policymakers about how place matters, not just the aging part, but where literally a person is. This is the goal of nearly all adults surveyed. Before the pandemic, if you surveyed Americans, it was about 90% said they wanted to age in place. It's probably about 100% post-pandemic. What does this term usually refer to?
Yeah, thank you, Nancy. It's lovely to be here with all of you today to talk about this important topic. There is no single standard definition of aging in place. Some people use the term to mean never moving from a long time home. Others think of it as staying as long as possible, but leaving open the possibility of moving to a more supportive environment at some point. Still others consider aging in place to mean living anywhere in one's community, really, moving to age in place, but staying within that community. And I think, most people would say it involves living anywhere outside of institutional care. But all of those different definitions matter because we run the risk, I think, of talking past one another when we have different ideas in mind. And each definition has a slightly different connotation for policy. So a goal of helping people remain in their homes forever leads to different policies than the goal of helping people stay in their community, but perhaps in a more in a different home, for instance. So in the US, we often talk about aging in place in this undefined way as the goal of older adults, but we're not, I think, so great at showing people options other than current home and nursing home. So how might people wish to live if they had more options? Or how might they answer the question to where they want to live if they knew about other options or had other options than their current home or nursing home? So these are things that I think we need to sort of get at, break down these definitions, be more explicit, and talk about this place and talk about the place beyond the home, but the neighborhood and the community as well.
Thank you, Jen. And I'm going to turn to Andrew next to expand on this a bit, because you have been part of truly innovative research on dementia and place. And your research has looked at older adults, specifically older adults with dementia and older adults who are caregivers or care partners experience their neighborhoods. Why would you argue that it's important that our concept of aging in place include more than just one's own home?
Yeah, you're right. So obviously the home where someone lives is important, but what my own work and work with colleagues with people living with dementia has shown that really we need to also take account of the environments beyond the home, what we typically call neighborhoods. Sometimes we kind of erroneously refer to them as community. And I think these are important for quite a few reasons. First of all, in terms of as we age, the local places around and about our homes can become increasingly important to us, perhaps because of mobility issues or resource issues, but also because we know that older people perhaps have more time to spend in home places and environments closer to home. In my own work with people living with dementia, what we can also see, though, are that local places can provide a kind of social infrastructure. So this is about the ability to access local resources or organizations, but also to be able to engage with a local sort of social life. And by this, I'm not kind of talking about harking back to a sort of golden age of community, but rather it's about people being able to participate in interactions and engagements with other people beyond the home, people who are perhaps not necessarily family or friends, but a broader sort of suite of acquaintances. And what we start to see in our own work is that ability to connect with other people, these kind of less intimate others, can provide a sense of connection. And through that connection, we can also find a sense of belonging. And also through that, also a sense of kind of social citizenship, or a kind of sense of participation in a wider sort of public sphere. I think the second point really I want to make from my own work around neighborhoods and homes is that the boundary between the neighborhood and the home is really porous. And I think that that porosity can increase as we age. So we know that people and objects and services come into the home, but so too do people go out of the home as well. And I think it's really important that we don't just think that the neighborhood starts when someone opens their front door, not least because when we start to think about where does someone feel at home, it doesn't necessarily have to be the bricks and mortar of a house, but someone could feel at home in all sorts of different sorts of places. And that kind of leads me really to a third point, that when we think of aging in place, we also don't just have to think about local neighborhoods, but we can think of all sorts of places where people might feel at home or feel that they have a connection or a sense of belonging. So these might be places in another part of the town or city. They might be places in another part of the world. But also what we saw, I think, amplified during the pandemic is that there's also a kind of digital space where some people can also start to feel that they belong and that they can feel connected to. So, of course, there are all sorts of inequalities in that, inequalities around access, inequalities around a sense of belonging and stuff. But to answer your question directly, I think, that they're the three reasons why I think we need to think, about aging in place as being about more than the bricks and mortar of one's house.
Thank you, Andrew. I think that's so helpful. During the pandemic, we certainly saw digital places opening up, and the concept of digital equity getting way beyond the idea that old people can't learn about technology or something, to help us to understand how do people learn. If you're not in the workforce, you don't have an IT person or a savvy colleague to show you things, but you can learn. You can learn very quickly. But also, and we've dropped a link to some of your work in the chat, just so that people can get a grip on this very rich research. I think for our audience members who come out of bioethics, we so often think about clinical settings when we're thinking about aging, especially when we mention any age-associated condition, or we imagine the home is home care, and we start hearing about home and hospital in the home, or how do we there. That's important. That's a thing. But when we are talking about how people are living their lives, it certainly is not just about managing their health or managing going to the doctor or figuring out how they get doctor visits in the home or something like that. So I think that's one thing that your research really shows, is that people's mental map of what matters to them is not limited to healthcare visits or how do I get, that's important, but it's not the only thing. Turning now to Paul, because you and Andrew have been working in the same region in different ways. You've been successful, most successful policymaker, or I think I can imagine, in elevating aging in place in the policy agenda in Greater Manchester, in a major metropolitan area, that we can picture if we know New York City and we think of the suburbs, or Greater Boston and we think about the suburbs. This is a large region, and it isn't just one town or city. You have to be convincing to a lot of different people. And you've written up your top 10 tips for advocates, which we'll share. So I'm going to ask two questions. One is, what has worked in your region that may work in other cities and regions? And a later question is going to be about your framework for age-friendly homes. But just in terms of the aging hub, what's actually worked?
Well, thanks for inviting me. And I think the main learning that that I've had from doing this work for over 20 years, I wrote my first action plan on older people and aging in 1997 for Manchester City Council. And the themes in it were around housing, social isolation, poverty, and things to do, and essentially the same things that we have now, you know. So there's on one level, not much has changed, but lots of the other things have changed. And over those 20 odd years, I think what we've realized by doing, rather than setting out to do this, is the building of an ecosystem of organizations and agencies and individuals that are really behind a common or a fairly common vision of how we see aging and older people. And that ecosystem includes a research and academic colleagues such as Andrew and the other two main universities in Greater Manchester. And those partnerships have been going for 15 years or more. We have a platform for older people in Greater Manchester, the Older People's Network, an advisory mayoral panel on older people. We have advocates in the 10 local authorities, NHS organisations, physical activity organisations, and so on. And we meet every week for an hour now. One of the things that the pandemic did was create an online space for us to discuss everything from the nighttime economy in older people. Today we had a meeting, 20 organisations on mental health strategy, and we discuss everything and anything. And core to that has been my luck, I suppose, or ability to build a team inside the combined authority, the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. There'll be about 10 or 11 of us in the new year, and that's funded by philanthropic organisations, charities, local government and NHS organisations. And I think it's unique in the UK, having that kind of scale and scope. So aging, my interest, or our interest in aging in place, I think, comes from my experience of a very changing city and city region. You know, older people in the urban areas in Manchester and Greater Manchester are living in areas of huge demographic change and shift. There's a huge churn in our inner city areas. And inside of those areas, you've got relatively small numbers of older adults living where the social infrastructure doesn't necessarily match up to their desires and expectations, where their next door neighbours change every 12 months because they may be students or young professionals and so on. So aging in place is one of our our new strategy will coming out in the new year. It's one of our 4 strategic themes. And I think we've been able to keep the focus on it as a theme by developing a shared narrative, particularly around the WHO age-friendly neighbourhoods and city model. I think that's a good narrative. It gives everybody something to do. It's easily recognisable and understandable. You have to overlay that with, I think, a series of emblematic projects. So things that you can point to and show are part of your kind of social movement and ecosystem. So we've done everything from sexual health guides for older people or older adults. We have an over 60s nightclub in the city centre, which is trying to disrupt ideas of what city centres are for in the nighttime economy. We've got an LGBT plus housing programme coming online soon. And we have a whole series of these things. Now, having said all that, trying to get political buy-in for these programmes is and remains a challenge. You know, I wouldn't want to say that our programme and our objectives are in the top 5 priorities of our elected mayor or elected politicians. I don't think they are yet. And I think even if you look at countries such as Japan and Korea, where they have very quickly aging populations, I still think they're struggling with trying to position this issue, particularly around housing, as a central issue. And our job has been made more difficult, I think, through austerity, through COVID, through gentrification, and I think also through a consistently dominant narrative, biomedical narrative of aging, which is based on deficit, and even on public health narratives of aging, which I think still are informed by medical. So the last thing I'd just say is that I think, we're in the foothills, I think, of this this type of work. I think the next 10 years will be decisive in the kind of advanced economies in North America and Western Europe. I think lots of innovation will come from the private sector, because I think the private sector in some ways has more scope and incentive to do more work here, because I think the public sector is struggling with significant challenges. And so I think our job in policy making is to try and capture the best innovations from the private sector, to give older adults a voice in this process, and trying to create these partnerships which will create the best of all the different sectors. And so back to the ecosystem, really. So that's kind of my take on where we are at the moment.
Thanks, Paul. You anticipated my next question, which is, how are older adults involved in the Aging Hub as people who are identifying on the ground challenges? I'm thinking especially for our listeners in the United States who are used to the rhetoric of, well, your home is, it was really on you to save enough money to have the retirement you want. And we know from Jen's research that the vast majority of older adults are not wealthy, but they may not be poor enough for subsidized housing. So there's a lot of people struggling with housing costs. We know that I read the British press every day. We know that heating costs are a huge challenge in the UK right now. And so how do you keep the priorities real when you are talking to older adults in your region, and then consolidating these insights for policymakers to see, here's what's doable, here's what would make a difference?
I think, the approach we've taken, I set up a board of older people in 2003, 2004, which still meets every 2 months in the city of Manchester. And that board brings before it a series of policy leaders and political leaders from the city. And they've had an enormous impact over those 20 years, I think, on a whole range of issues, because their voices aren't routinely heard, I think. So at a Greater Manchester level, we have, as I mentioned before, a network for older adults supported by a third sector organisation. And what we endeavour to ensure in all of our work is that they sit around the same tables as us. So we had a meeting earlier this week on our Ageing in Place Pathfinder, which is a £4 million programme which is being funded, set up now in 8 Greater Manchester neighbourhoods. And the chair of the Older People's Network and the chair of the Older People's Panel sit around those tables. But you have to go beyond that. You have to try and deepen your understanding. So the projects and programs that Andrew runs and our other colleagues run are really important to us in terms of understanding conceptually and from a research point of view how older people experience the city and the city region. So you have to take insights from experienced and well-organized
I think we may have a freeze, like an internet freeze.
I like just hanging out in cafes and finding out what's going on. You have to kind of have some kind of ethnographic kind of thing. And that's what we train all of our team to do, hang out.
Yes, the value of hanging out. That's every ethnographer I know says that's pretty much what I'm doing, sometimes for years. I've put in the chat for everyone the link to the photo library that is run by one of your partners, the Center for Aging Better. It is a tremendous resource internationally, and I want to give them a shout out. We use them for our report. They have a wonderful library of free, easy to use images of a wide range of older adults, very diverse, probably in and around Manchester or Greater London, I'm not sure, but demographically, it looks pretty similar to the United States, doing everyday things. They're not all just people winning like ultra marathons, nor are they pictures of people with like canes and walkers and kind of these, if you go to Google, you're going to get these very clinical images. And so I encourage you to look around. There's also a wonderful guide in there to how to use images of aging and disability responsibly. Great stuff. So shout out to your partners. So turning out to Steve and to another major city, you're an architect familiar with the challenges of aging buildings, not just thinking about aging society, but also aging infrastructures. When you were at the New York City Housing Authority, the Capital Projects Division held a design charrette, an intensive problem-solving exercise to comprehensively modernize buildings to new codes and standards. When we think about modernization efforts and getting buildings up to code and getting them more accessible, how well do they account for the needs of older or disabled residents?
Thank you very much, Nancy. It's, first of all, a pleasure to be part of this panel discussing this important topic. So for the audience, comprehensive modernization is gut rehabilitation. It's going in and doing full renovations within the apartments and the buildings and the systems. I think, as you mentioned, Capital Projects Division at the New York City Housing Authority started to think about this concept in 2014, but the funding really wasn't there at that time period. And then there were some changes in how one funds projects that happened around 2019. And then there was a HUD agreement for those that are from New York City area and have been following housing. That made funding available and made the idea possible. And so the first action plans that I was involved with the monitor, we first start to formalize this concept of taking a building and doing full renovations into it. And there's two St. Nicholas houses in Manhattan and Todd Hill in Staten Island. And really the question was, how are we going to pull this off? Paul mentioned everyone at the table. And that's exactly what we wanted to do. We didn't want to have a bubble. And so NYCHA teamed up with residents and facility managers and engineers and contractors and budget analysis to tackle the challenges that it would take to comprehensively repair a building. And that outcome was the Comprehensive Modernization White Paper, and then the request for proposals or RFPs for design build services to do that. You asked, how do these efforts account for the needs of older disabled residents? I would say the buildings are past repair in New York City for the Housing Authority. And to bring those buildings back to a state of regular maintenance is thus preserving public housing, and it really accounts for everybody. It doesn't matter what your age is, and it's what's going to make sure that New York is as diverse as it can be. But with that, what we're talking about is a holistic look. It's not just a replacement in kind. And so you start to use building science to think about mechanical systems that are going to provide heat and cooling. Right now, most of these 1940s buildings only have steam heat. And so that doesn't really work for elders, as well as climate change that's happening in New York. New electrical systems to provide for the needs of everybody, including Wi-Fi systems, new elevators that don't break down, generators to run those elevators when you have brownouts or blackouts, bringing the buildings up to code for fire suppression, new kitchens, bathrooms to meet the current codes for regarding accessibility. So in general, the idea of a comprehensive modernization is not just for seniors, but it is for everyone within those buildings that, again, they're at a place in time in which if we don't, as a city, repair these and get them back to a starting point, we'll lose them.
Thank you, Steve. we've been getting some amazing, wonderful questions, and I'm going to try to weave them in, as I mentioned. And I'm just going to turn to my colleague, Jen, because one said, okay, these are great urban, maybe greater suburban examples. What were some key differences and key points when we're thinking about rural areas or more remote areas? Some of our past webinars have looked at these issues, and I'm recalling one where the presenter was from Greater Memphis, and she was pointing about building modifications for older residents who had housing. She was actually from Habitat for Humanity, and this wasn't a case of building houses, it was a case of modifying the housing you had. And she said there was a big difference between what you would do if somebody lived in the city and was plugged into the sewer system versus when you went out, not too far out, but you were suddenly in the countryside and you were dealing with septic systems or Wi-Fi that had never been put into place properly. And so we found that throughout our research, when we went into more rural areas, people said there are basic infrastructure issues that were never dealt with in our region that become a challenge to serve people who are aging in place and maybe driving less or not driving at all. To try to figure out how to get the services that they need to them. But I wondered, Jen, are there any points or anything that would be helpful to somebody who's thinking about a more rural or geographically remote area?
I think at the level of the house, certainly the issues are different. I think in high cost coastal areas like New York or Boston, we're seeing houses in great need of repair, but there's a lot of pressure on that real estate. And you could imagine, not that older adults often want to do this, they could move and sell that house and free up some equity, but that is not really the case in some of these areas. And I recall in that conversation with our colleague from Memphis, the comment that repairing those houses and helping people remain in them safely and securely with accessibility was also about preserving the housing stock. Which is another question. I think another issue in rural areas is we really have very little alternative to a single family home. And we know that many people don't find their single family homes to be manageable or accessible. So we really need more options to that. I think the infrastructure that you mentioned is right there with broadband, with transportation for people who choose not to drive. Also, just thinking about medical resources, we know that it's just harder to get to specialists, it's harder to get primary care physicians. And so some recent research we've been just looking at where people are aging and how that affects their risk of climate change. There's a lot of things in rural areas that predispose people to some greater risks and also predispose them to poorer health that can then be affected. So I think there's a lot to think about there. A lot of opportunities to address these differences.
Thank you, Jen. So we have so many wonderful questions, and we're going to be consolidating the questions in the chat to after the fact when we post things online to see if we can, get some more resources to people. But let's move on to another narrative, another big master narrative that can affect how we think about challenges and opportunities when we're housing aging societies. And some of these issues, as you may imagine, also involve housing disabled populations as well. Not exactly the same, but some similar issues around mobility and accessibility and so on. But let's talk about what, at least in the United States, we call NIMBY, a shorthand, not in my backyard, as a narrative that must be anticipated and countered when we think about housing that is affordable, accessible, or simply different from existing housing stock. Sometimes you will see community level opposition when this is the idea of having housing for a particular population or that looks a particular way is expressed as a threat to property values or a community's character, which can be code for other things. So when people who do have housing, who are housing secure, reject efforts to help other people who may have lived in the same community for years but now have different needs achieve the same goal, this is a moral problem and it's a practical problem. So what works to counter NIMBY narratives or things that may edge in that direction of, I'm not sure, is this going to be too much change, and position age-friendly housing and planning as a community asset? Paul, how did the framework for creating age-friendly homes in Greater Manchester take shape? And how did you get buy-in, or did you face what we call NIMBY? And how did you flip that script?
So, we launched the framework last year, I think it was, and it's a good document because it's the result of a long-term program of activities and relationships, actually, which I think is critical. It's a document which expresses a moment in time in terms of the relationships that we built up between in our ecosystem of different partners. And critical to it were the voices of some developers and public housing leaders, older people again, and the themes in it were were designed as a platform to encourage activity. Now, what I would say is that of all the themes, all the areas of work that I'm involved in, housing is the most difficult thing to do. It's the most difficult thing to shift because it's political, as you kind of suggest. It takes a long time. There's large amounts of money involved, and it disrupts as well as and enhances people's lives. So I think, and also housing is so important to our well-being. I mean, we've had that discussion. So I think it's the most difficult thing that I'm involved in. And ironically, generally speaking, I don't think we've had significant problems around the kind of NIMBYism around older people's housing, in my experience. Manchester and the city of Manchester and Greater Manchester have really been ongoing a set of other challenges, which is the expansion of housing for young professionals and family homes. And actually, I think if we were being honest, there's been one element of that development over the last 20 years has been around older people's housing. There are issues, I think, around on some of the outskirts of Greater Manchester, on some of the better off, more rural areas. I think there have been campaigns around, including the Green Belt in our housing development programs. And arguably that's been the biggest mass movement there's been in Greater Manchester over the last 10 years, which has been against some of those plans. So I think part of the answer to that is explaining to local communities, particularly many of which, as you kind of suggested, are older themselves, that we need a mix and we need options to support aging in place in some of those rural and semi-rural places as well as in urban places. So I think that's the kind of sweet spot to in terms of messaging and public relations. And I think particularly new models which are small scale and which are seen as being part of the community and owned by the community is also part of that answer as well.
Thank you, Paul. Jen, I know you've talked about the challenge of, when we imagine aging in places only where you are right now, and as a counter to where you don't want to go, a nursing home, but we don't show people anything in between. We can't be surprised that we wind up with rather constrained ideas, services propping up maybe housing stock that isn't working for the person. So maybe you want, do you want to respond to what Paul's been working on and see, is there a way to translate some of these ideas into the United States and other contexts?
Yes, Paul, I love the report. I think it's, as a planner, I love it. It's comprehensive. I appreciate, everyone should read it. It's this approach of older people as valuable, not vulnerable. But as a device for changing the narrative, I think it's really inspiring. I think it's first of all, very clear and it's very positive. That you're laying out a vision of housing choices that respond to different needs and aspirations. I love that you express the vision in the present tense as though it's already happened. The framework, I think it recognizes the critical role of older adults in shaping the strategies that you want to achieve this. And you talk about celebrating, good examples and the places that people want to live. So I think it's really a wonderful plan. And you're not shying away from the challenges either, but I think that positivity is really exciting. And I think, part of why, even though we are all, hopefully universally aspiring to be aging and need housing in places that we want to live, we still face, I think, NIMBYism in the United States about housing just because of, its concerns about parking and traffic and all those things. But I also think when it comes to aging, we're not so good about talking about aging in general. And people, myself included, often don't want to, think about changing needs or a day when the house that you have might not be suitable. So it's not something I think that is an exciting conversation, but I think that you have, by providing options and providing a vision of a really positive, outcome, it does become exciting. And so I think, those were my thoughts. I just really liked it.
So, Andrew, I wonder, since you're familiar with the region that Paul is discussing, I wonder if there's some insights from your socially engaged research in Salford that might go to this, especially beyond the home itself. I'm thinking of the example of when you ask people to take them on a tour of your neighborhood, it included a bus route, which technically might take a person out of a neighborhood, but it was on their mental map of what mattered to them. So, anything else that if you wanted to think about age friendliness or aging in place beyond planning and building housing, that one would want to, as a policymaker and also as a member of the public, wanted to keep on your imagination?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, because as you asked the initial question to Paul, I think I agree quite a lot with what Paul was saying around this idea of NIMBYism and challenge, at least in Greater Manchester. I suppose what I was also thinking, though, was in your question, I think you really hit the nail on the head when you presented this as a moral issue and not just an economic or a practical one, because I think aging in place and developing age-friendly housing and communities is something about social justice. And I think this is about creating neighborhoods and housing for all. So I suppose one of the things that's emerged from the work is that, yes, we can talk a lot about lifetime homes, homes for life, but I think we should also start to think about lifetime neighborhoods and start to think much more about how some of the modifications that are put in perhaps to support older people to age in place will also benefit all kinds of people in all sorts of ways. Certainly what we have found with our own work in terms of sort of this age-friendly neighborhood idea is that it is people are very keen to avoid ideas around segregation. So when we think about opposition, sometimes it is opposition to, what is the opposition to these kinds of developments? Is it built around fear or threat, or is it around change to what people already know, or is it around some discrimination or stigma? And we know that debate about aging is replete with these issues around stigmatizing discourses. And I think one of the things that Greater Manchester have worked really hard on, and other organizations, is try to counter some of those ideas. And I think the other thing in terms of opposition and challenge is to also think about who has the opportunity to have their voices heard and who has the opportunity to be listened to. Because we know that aging in place is political, but not just with a capital P, but political in terms of who has the right to say who can age in place and who is able to age in the places that they want to age successfully in. And so it's also about ensuring that there's attention and effort is played to understanding the diversity of what it means to age, so that actually, we know I'm always reminded that people say, once you've met an older person, you have met an older person. Mm-hmm. And it's about recognizing that actually there is diversity amongst older people. And that goes for Salford and Greater Manchester as much as anywhere else. So I also think it's about ensuring that successfully aging in place is about enabling all kinds of people from all different sorts of backgrounds and perspectives to continue to choose where they want to grow older in.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. I'm often, when I think about aging in place, I live in New York City, and sometimes there's this idea, well, the city's a great place to age because you've got a transportation system and you've got a cafe down the street, and well, they're getting the subways more accessible. All the elevators don't go all the way to the platform, but you're getting there. But a lot of older people, and Jen would know, just the percentages, a lot of older people live in the suburbs because they moved to the suburbs in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s when the suburbs were being developed. And so your place may have been a place where you have lived, for 60 years where you've put your children through that school system and have continued to pay taxes to those authorities. You are very much part of that community. And yet when we think of a place as a good place to raise a family, but we never developed a way of thinking about it as a good place to age, we then see, well, the good place to age is the lifestyle community that you have to have a great deal of money to go into. And if we only think of that as, well, that's the right way to age, a colleague of ours coined the term plutonormativity, the idea, well, you should have money. That's how you get what you want, and that's a problem. But if we don't think about that, we're also prone to projecting fantasies onto other places. We read about one place in the Netherlands or one place in France, or a whole region. I have a colleague who's an Asian gerontologist, a Japanese American, who says, people tell me all the times about how great it is in Asia. And I try to say, Asia's a very big place. It's very complicated. We don't just have one magical solution. But I worry that sometimes when we project a solution onto another country, it's a way of saying, oh, that can't work here. We can't do it here. And so I appreciate all of these different ways that you've got policymakers, advocates, older adults, researchers working together to get in real places, not fantasy places. We could do this all day, but since time is short, I just am going to shout out to something that is in the chat. Steve Lovesey has, when he was at the New York City Housing Authority, the Capital Projects Division worked with the city planning, Division of City Planning, to create connected communities, recognizing that housing providers are also often adjacent to open space. So when you're thinking about how to use space in a community, this is an opportunity for planners and housers to work together to think about what benefits that neighborhood. So that link is in the chat as a guidebook. So now turning to our final big narrative is compliance or existing funding as constraints on how we think about good outcomes through housing. Jen, your research has shown that at least in the United States, affordable housing developers and managers must prioritize compliance with their financing requirements over designing housing that best supports people as they age. Steve, when you're coming up as an architect or a planner, you have these wonderful visions of how housing can be designed, and then it runs into the reality of mandates and guidelines and financing and so on. You and Jen have made some identical points about as planners and architects who work in the public sector. And Jen has also mentioned that our financing systems tend to segregate older people, even though multi-generational housing might be more appealing to people. They might say, I would like to live with a mix of people. I like seeing children around. So you've suggested, Jen, that one policy narrative that we may need to challenge is the one that goes like this. Well, what can you do with existing funding? Because maybe that existing framework is part of the problem. It's constraining our imagination. Bearing in mind that economic concerns are real and we live in a non-ideal world and all of those things, I wonder if we can open up this question about when we have requirements that are perhaps too rigid or designed for a previous generation of the problem, how that can pose barriers to freeing up our policymaking imagination and our moral imagination, which is the idea of doing something better. So Jen, I'm going to turn to you first because it started as a conversation we were having and then open it up to others.
Right. Yeah. So, I think developers of affordable housing are working with a lot of constraints, and I know Stephen can attest to this. In this part of the country, you need over $500,000 to build a basic modest apartment, given the cost of land. And then when you affordable to someone earning an extremely low income, which is generally defined as under 30% of your area median income, you need to rely on a lot of subsidies to reduce costs so that rent can ultimately be kept low. So in today's landscape, that often means numerous funding sources, federal, state, local dollars that pull from all these different programs, and all these different programs have different requirements and different regulations. They're sometimes intended for different populations. So I think, kudos to the nonprofit developers who have all the skill to thread the needle through these programs in order to create high quality, affordable housing and to figure out how to do the community services and the community spaces on top of it. But this is a really challenging thing to do. And I think the one of the challenges that we heard about on a previous webinar related to our report was that we want housing dollars to be used for housing. And so there's this maximizing, how many units can we maximize? And that's sort of the outcome that, people are focused on. But we also want enriching healthy communities that include services and supports, and we want access to fresh air and the outside. And so balconies and outdoor spaces that, we think of as adding cost, but, the ultimate outcome isn't necessarily the number of units, although this is important, but it's the well-being of the people in those housing unit, in that housing. And I would argue we do have enough money to do both. It's a matter of priority, and it is a moral issue, as Nancy said.
Anyone else like to have a go on this particular question? Steve?
Nancy, one of the things that had to happen in the public sector is the leveraging of funds. Funds are typically allocated for a specific item. The housing authority is doing a fully electrified building, but it's taking, as Jennifer said, multiple funding streams from multiple agencies in order to kind of pull it all together to make the final outcome the way you want it. In my new role in the nonprofit sector doing affordable housing, we have so many great there are great policies out there. There's great guidebooks that then become policy. But a lot of times it has to do with the least common denominator. And those individuals who are trying to do more tend to get held back by those policies by saying, okay, well, this is all you can do. And, one size doesn't always fit all. And I think in general, as we build out these policies, we have to provide some movement. So those affordable housing companies that want to do more, want to make bigger apartments, but with the same dollar amount, or want to create open space, or want to do those items that benefit the neighborhood and the community, can do those and are not just stuck with, no, I'm sorry, the guidebook says you're going to have a 9-foot by 9-foot apartment, and that's what you're going to get. And you can't go beyond that, or you lose your funding.
Thank you, Steve. So some of this is not just people saying do more with less, it's siloing of policy efforts. Something has had design guidelines happen in one place, and the reality of what you've got, the land you've got to use, and the number of units you have to fit in there. That's actually something that Jen and I will be taking up in a new project with policymakers to look at some of these challenges when housing and aging society is split across maybe too many domains, and how to get people to work together. Anyone, Paul or Andrew, if there's anything about this issue of the constraints of compliance, or maybe austerity, or whatever it may be, and how hard it is to dream and bring a better future into reality, or when you have an aging population, to say, I cannot solve this problem right now, but I can solve it for the next generation of older adults.
I think there's an interesting dance that goes on in policy making situations when we discuss these issues. So we've just had a new census in the UK, 2021. It tells a story we'll all be familiar with. Far more older people than there used to be, and will be in the future. For the first time in the UK, there are more people aged over 65 than there are under 15. And you can take that into a policy room, and you can put the graph up, which says, well, it's like that. And everybody goes, oh my God, what are we going to do about, oh, right, yeah, we've got to do something about this. And then they go back to their offices and to their organizations that have 2 or 3 year policy cycles, or political pressures or organizational pressures. And those longer term issues are suddenly become long-term issues, and trying to connect what we see and what we argue right now and what we know about the aging population to practical programs of activity which stretch out ahead of us, I think is a real challenge for us. Now, I think the other thing that's going on, certainly in the UK, is if you talk about housing and aging populations, generally the response you will get, and sometimes it's explicit, sometimes it's said in the corner of a room when people don't want to hear it, is that, the real problem is that we've got too many older people living in houses that are too big. We need to get them out of them and to free them up for families, and we need to build specialist housing, maybe the other side of the city, but somewhere else to free up family housing. They put those two things together, and what it does, it creates a really difficult environment to try and create a movement in which people are taking action on this agenda. The compliance thing, I think, is less of an issue for us, I feel, in the way that you've described it. I think the framework in which we're working is slightly different. And the last thing I would say is that although the government have just announced a new programme around housing and older people in the UK, we've had no national strategy on ageing in England since 2010-11. There's been no real strategy around housing and ageing for the whole of that period. And what happens is that local government and National Health Organisation and others don't feel obliged to act. And so there's this gap really in policy making in the UK, and most of the focus tends to be on young people getting on into the housing market, building new houses for younger people and families, which absolutely is an important thing. But there's just a huge gap in policy making and leadership on this issue.
Thank you, Paul. Anything else on this point? Andrew, I was wondering. We had a lot of people really interested in your work on dementia in place, which I don't know if any of those research sites are in North America, and if not, we need to get them in North America as well to understand to draw those maps that we need. And I'm wondering if around these issues of compliance and funding and what policy buckets we put things in. I've noticed, because a lot of my work on bioethics for aging societies also focuses on dementia, is if we imagine that people with dementia are at home being cared for, but not active in some way, we're missing something. I was talking with somebody from Leading Age, which is a major advocate for older adults in the United States, and they were talking about the state master plan, and it was all about healthy aging, and it was all about 60-year-olds. And when she raised a question, she said, well, this works for me, but what about my parents? They said, well, we're sort of hoping that if people are healthy enough, they won't have those problems, which really seemed like a missed opportunity here. And I'm wondering, how can we make sure that the needs of people with foreseeable age-associated conditions, whether cognitive or physical and others, and this is where aging and disability overlap, although they're not exactly the same thing, how do we keep that in the picture as well? So we don't imagine, but when you're sick enough, you're not really a community member anymore. You're not, I should say, part of your neighborhood. I think we might have a freeze.
So I think
We're back.
So I think one of the things that we start to see, and I suppose the response that I've had to the previous discussion, is that these are issues that are too important just to be left to kind of aging specialists. I guess these are decisions that, that all sorts of organizations and departments and specialists and experts, as well as older people themselves, of course, need to be a part of the decision-making process. I suppose in terms of thinking about people aging with dementia, particularly in communities, is that it's about thinking that the resources and the support for people living with dementia shouldn't just be left to the health and social care experts or the health and social care funding pots, just like, otherwise the risk is, I think, that the focus on aging in place focuses perhaps a bit too much on this narrative of healthy aging, to the extent that anybody who is perhaps doesn't fall within that category or doesn't recognize themselves within that class has to go and find funding and support somewhere else. So I suppose my point really is that these are too big the issues for just aging specialists to try and focus on. I guess the point or the role for aging specialists is to make sure that these issues are able to remain at the top of the agenda. And I suppose what we are seeing is that it is, really difficult to keep aging, up there as one of the headline issues for people to be thinking and working on.
Thank you, Andrew. Well, we are at the end of our hour. Really could have kept going, and the questions are extraordinary. I've done my best to weave them in, but we've got not just questions, but examples from Canada, from the UK, from different parts of the United States, things that we will do our best to weave in when we post the link to this webinar. I think probably what we'll need to do is a bit of editing work, so we have all these wonderful examples as well as continuing questions. Now, some of these questions we're going to be able to take up in a new project, which is funded by the Greenwall Foundation in the United States, that is going to enable us to use what Jen and I call the housing lens, the idea of using housing as the way we look at aging, rather than using a medical model, but saying, well, if this is housing and neighborhood are integral to our experiences of aging, an everyday experience of aging, how do we make sure that we don't forget that when we are making policy concerning aging? So we are going to be looking at a number of policy-making challenges, some of these knots that seem to prevent us from either making progress on meeting housing shortages in aging societies, even when these are known problems that go way back, that we don't have enough affordable, accessible housing unless one is rich. And also just situations where people cannot, the paperwork is so onerous that people cannot go into housing that does exist because of eligibility requirements. These are things that policymakers struggle with. We're going to be looking for ways that we can, not in an ivory tower way, but in a very practical way, help to present solutions to these that then can be written into policy and maybe adapted. So more on that as we come, but as we're at the end of our time, I want to thank our wonderful panelists today. I want to thank our behind the scenes team, Ashna Lal and Bailey Hu, and I want to thank all of our audience members for coming with us today on this journey and for giving us so much to think about. Thank you and have a wonderful day.
And as a reminder, a recording of the webinar will be available at www.thehastingscenter.org. Thank you all again.